What if everything we've been told about overcoming trauma and mental health challenges, that time heals all wounds, that willpower is enough, that traditional therapy is the only path, is fundamentally incomplete? Hello and welcome to Believe in Aliens, a podcast that celebrates the extraordinary journeys of people who leave everything they know behind to build towards a bigger purpose. This show offers an intimate look into the resilience, ambition, and unique perspectives of those who defy the odds and seek to transform our world. In each episode, we explore the insights of individuals who challenge the status quo and whose stories might provoke you to rethink your own perspectives. Today, we're honored to welcome Federico Menapace, the former Deputy Director and Chief Operating Officer of Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, shortly MAPS. Fede embodies the kind of radical thinking to challenge conventional wisdom we want to share with you. Fede's journey from the Italian Alps is remarkable. Starting his career building actual bridges in Italy, he literally constructed pathways before discovering his true calling, building bridges to mental wellness. After earning his MBA from Stanford, Fede dove headfirst into the tech world. But it was his own profound personal journey through anxiety and his transformative healing that redirected his life's entire mission. Today, he's with us with experience helping and pioneering the future of mental health treatment, having led groundbreaking phase 3 clinical trials and raising over $250 million to bring psychedelic-assisted therapies to those who need them the most. In this episode, we'll explore 3 things: why traditional therapy sometimes fails millions, and how psychedelics are rewriting the mental health playbook; Fede's radical career pivot that challenges everything we think we know about success; and finally, why being an outsider is your superpower. How Fede's Italian roots and non-medical background let him see solutions that industry insiders often miss. Fede, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing really well, thank you. I'm excited to be here and to finally record this podcast after a few conversations you and I had that have been really illuminating.
Well, I really appreciate that. I actually want to start with something that was on my mind. Multidisciplinary. It's a word that is got a lot of letters, but when you think about what MAPS was really focusing on, multidisciplinary, what does that mean?
I'd really like to refer and honor Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS. It's often said that MAPS was started as a political science organization. Of course, it's been a scientific organization for decades, raising funds, awareness, and conducting clinical trials for the use of MDMA-assisted therapy, primarily for the treatment of PTSD. But it's been very much of an effort that hasn't just comprised science. For instance, MAPS has focused on clinical trials, but it's also focused on drug policy reform. It's also focused on communication. And it's also focused on building partnerships with local and international organizations, both in government and academia and nonprofit. And the reason being that psychedelics became a very controversial topic after the late 60s and the early 70s, and when the Controlled Substances Act made several psychedelics illegal, lots of the research was really stifled, and it became really difficult for researchers to continue to do the work that began in the 50s. And so in order to unlock research, work needed to be done in a variety of directions. And so if we just fast forward, what we're seeing today, access to psychedelics and psychedelic therapies is actually happening in a variety of directions, not only through medical research, aiming at obtaining FDA approval, but also through state level reform, local reform, and through religious use, for instance. So in order to be able to go from a place of total blockage of access to these therapies to when they will be available to as many people as possible and very widely, many different routes need to be followed. And so that's, I would say, is the key of the multidisciplinary nature.
It begs the next question. How much do we understand about psychedelic application in what, as you alluded to, the Controlled Substance Act changed a lot of how we had to look at it in this country. How would you like anyone listening to this podcast to think about psychedelics in this context?
Yeah. I would say that psychedelics have been used for hundreds and sometimes thousands of years based on cultures to help people, I guess, have the best interface with life as possible and for healing purposes. And so the fact that from a regulatory perspective in the 70s, it was determined that these substances don't have medical use and they have high risk of abuse was a great mischaracterization of the substances and the potential of these substances. We definitely know a great deal about how these substances are being used by indigenous culture all over the world. And we know a great deal at this point of what are some of the clinical outcomes that they can facilitate. For instance, if we look at medical research and clinical research that's been done for MDMA or psilocybin therapies, we now know that they can have a great promise of decreasing PTSD symptoms as well as depression and anxiety symptoms, and being possibly very effective in a variety of other indications. And for the longest time, we didn't really know so much about the mechanisms of actions and so how the actual psychedelics work in the brain. But over the course of the past, I would say decade, or a couple of decades, a lot of academic research has actually focused on that as well. And so leading universities around the world and in the US, in London Imperial College, and then Johns Hopkins and NYU, and many universities at this point have looked at doing studies with functional MRI. So looking at the brain to see what happens when psychedelics are being taken, and more and more basic research around how this is actually working at a neuron level is being unlocked. I would say at this point, we know a great deal, but I think what's most important is that we know that they can be helpful for people that struggle with mental illness. And so there is a lot of urgency in ensuring that in a safe way, these medicines can be made available for people through prescription and then through regulated access.
Your pathway to this is not traditional in many ways. We talked about it, right? You have degrees in engineering and you're building bridges. But your knowledge on the topic is evident. And I think it also alludes to, some personal experience that you've had to live through to get to this point. Before we jump into some of those kind of stories and experiences, maybe if you can first qualitatively describe the differences that you personally experienced in the healing process with therapies that expanded states of consciousness that made it really clear that it has unique potential in the world.
I think many people refer to psychedelic therapy as something that's as allowed to do years of therapy in one sitting. I think that really resonates with me. But the reason why is that psychedelics can be a tool to access parts of our inner world that are just usually not so accessible, even when doing psychotherapy. Particularly with MDMA, I can speak to it because it's probably the substance of the clinical research that I know best. MDMA plays a role in decreasing the activity in the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes stress and anxiety. And for a lot of people that have deep trauma, even recounting their deep trauma in a therapy session can be a very daunting experience. It can be scary, it can be triggering, and it was just really difficult. And so pairing a psychedelic like MDMA with therapy allows people to access their trauma in a less triggered state and in a way that actually allows them to process what happened. And I'm going to talk about this topic, and I think we can expand to it in the future, is the idea of addressing the root cause of somebody's illness as opposed to just treating the symptom.
Maybe this is a great place to jump in. Your personal healing process and the events that maybe led to you seeking and understanding that healing was important. To the extent you're willing to share, and I think so many listeners will probably relate to parts of your story. Where did this start for you? Why did you end up doing this work? What were the experiences that happened before you joined MAPS? Why was that important for you?
Yeah, I'm happy to share my story. My decision to work in the psychedelic medicine field is very much a decision that stemmed from a personal experience of healing that really opened my eyes to the potential of these treatments in a way that essentially made it an imperative for me to use the little time that I have on this earth to ensure that as many people as possible can safely access these modalities. And the reason why that is that in mind, it's really interesting how mental health and trauma even works. But for a lot of the time, me growing up, I didn't really realize like how much I struggled with trauma and with mental health. But I kind of realized that after I started addressing it later in life. So I grew up in a household that, in many respects was supportive and safe, but also my mother was severely mentally ill. She struggled with what we believe now was borderline personality disorder. So she had a really tough time regulating her emotions. And while she could be a very affectionate and loving person, she could also really even like turn into a person with bursts of anger, rage, and violence. And so that is an important adverse childhood event that can have a big impact in the development of a child. Um, and so then that evolved and progressively got worse over the course of time up until when I was 19, she eventually took her life. And the reason why that was particularly traumatic for me is that I unfortunately witnessed the event. And back at that time, I mean, I could refer to my life, like how my life was before this event and how it was after. It was a totally earth-shattering event. And I didn't really know how to react to it. I think somebody referred me to a therapist, and I did some therapy work for a period of time and actually found that to be extremely helpful. So I'm very grateful that I had access to this. And then after that course of therapy ended for after a few months, I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to go back to my life and just do what I know how to do best, which was studying. So I enrolled in college. I graduated. That was, for the most part, like really a blur for a few years. I remember after 5 years looking back, be like, oh, it really did take me 5 years to like resume operating more in a normal way. I was a very gregarious person before, very social, life of the party kind of person, and I really became agoraphobic after this traumatic event. And so I didn't really know how to fit in and operate in a group or in society at large. But life continued, and I was academically doing well, and then eventually worked as an engineer for a little while, and then I had an opportunity to go work for an American company, a consulting company. I actually joined McKinsey as a consultant in Milan, and so it was my first ability to kind of like really leave the place where I was growing up and realizing that I needed to get out, that it was still not a very nurturing place for me to be. It's probably felt like I needed to escape the reality that was so grim and uncomfortable. Then after working in consulting, or while working in consulting, I actually applied to go to business school. And I was lucky to be accepted to come and do business school in the US, which was a real big shift. And I remember meeting, I graduated from Stanford Business School in 2013. So I was there between 2011 and 2013. And I remember meeting all these amazing people, very successful, compassionate, just very interesting people. And some of them were experimenting with psychedelics. And I remember being very shocked. It was like, why would these people that are so successful take things that would ruin their brains? What a bad decision. You all have been so lucky. Why are you doing this to yourself? There's like a lot of judgment that I realized came from the more conservative upbringing of the community where I grew up. And then all of a sudden I realized that maybe I could challenge my own assumptions and actually experiment with some of these substances. And so I did. And I remember after taking MDMA for the first time, thinking, why is this illegal? This should be encouraged. It was a really eye-opening experience. And I think maybe one of the first times in my life, I realized I was living without dread or anxiety. Wow. It's like peeking out. You're like, oh, my whole life experience is in a way that I don't realize is that way. And I could see that for the first time after having this experience. And then a few experiences follow that. Some of them were really eye-opening, and like many people will describe, kind of broadened my horizons, but some of them were also really challenging. So material started coming up for me that was definitely related to, things of the past that I didn't really know how to take it in and how to address it. And that also led to, I remember, a pretty negative experience, particularly with psilocybin mushrooms in a recreational setting with friends. And then somebody that was at that party who was trained as a Zendo volunteer. Zendo is a program that teaches people how to sit for friends that are having a difficult psychedelic experience. She helped me out through that process. And then in the morning, she said, there are therapists that do this work of doing psychotherapy while you're under the influence of mushrooms, for example. It's something you might want to check out. And I remember I was curious about it, but also like pretty shocked from the experience. So it took a while, but then eventually, it was actually 10 years ago, I connected with a therapist that worked with psilocybin. And I had a few preparation sessions with them. And then I eventually did a therapy session while under the influence of psilocybin mushrooms. And that was the other main event in life that I could refer to as like what was my life before and what was my life after.
Oh,
It didn't take long to realize, after probably another couple of sessions, that if my mother had access to this type of treatment, things would have likely been very different. And that was the point in time when I resolved that I was going to stop doing what I was doing, which was pursuing a career in tech at the time, to work on making these treatments accessible to people, because I had lived and perceived such an increasing quality of life with getting rid of my general anxiety disorder, never had a depressive episode since, which I actually struggled with since I was a teenager. It was an incredibly liberating experience. And I think 10 years after, but now I'm married, I have a family of 3 beautiful children. I do the work that feels the most meaningful. And I want to offer this experience to whoever could benefit from it.
it's a remarkable transformation. And I mean, as I sat here and listened and felt your words, there are themes that emerge all over the place, right? There's themes of curiosity, themes of, having an outsider perspective, building and revealing your adversity muscle. And then ultimately, I hear so many of my own stories in what you're saying. I think you and I share a similar before first engagement of MDMA judgment pattern. I was very judgmental myself around it. And I still think I'm still going through what my trauma is, but to see you speak the way you do and accomplish what you've accomplished, I think is inspiring. So thank you.
You're welcome. In one of the sessions, psychedelic work sessions that I did, I remember having this vision of me as an adult today, standing right by the side of the 19-year-old version of myself and putting my hand on his shoulder and just really feeling for him in that moment, and showering this kid with infinite love and compassion.
Hmm.
And this is just a way, I think, for my system to unlock the ability to give myself self-love, which has been a whole journey for me to understand how to do that. What a beautiful gift to be able to unlock a way to nurture myself and understand the importance of self-care. If anything, ultimately, what my mother hadn't had the ability to discover, maybe very likely out of her own trauma. I think that this is something that just came up, that like a good example of how an expanded state could actually help me with healing.
that modality of it's also very common in therapy, is to write a letter to a younger version of yourself. What you're describing is far more profound. I think you were standing next to the version of yourself, which is ultimately a part of you. It brought shivers to me because, one of the things I did when I first started my therapy journey of cognitive behavioral therapy was write a letter to a young teenage version of myself that got made fun of a lot for the size of my nose. I'm not drawing equivalency between what you experienced and what I experienced. Rather, it was a place that I would push away a lot. And it was really hard. This is my first time ever talking about this candidly. And so thank you for sharing your story, because I think it does, even on a podcast where I'm supposed to be following a script, I think it evokes a very personal experience that I think we all hold deep down inside of us. I want to get back into the industry a little bit because I also want to talk about what you're doing now. MAPS is really well known in the industry as a company that got to phase 3 trials and submitted to FDA approvals. And certainly it looks like towards the very end of the process, something changed in terms of what you thought was the expected outcome. And I think there's like some updates that happened as recently as March, as I'm learning. And maybe you can share about what were some of the outcomes of the, I think, ICER review process, and how does that inform now your thinking about the industry going forward and where we're going to go in this country?
Well, I think we talked for hours about what ICER's talked about, and then what were the dynamics of the FDA advisory committee. But maybe I want to focus a little bit on like what could happen, looking forward, and what are some of the kind of shifts that are required in the system to allow for psychedelic therapy to become a way that could really positively affect a lot of people. So I think that there could be one of two outcomes that will happen in the near future for MDMA. One is that Lykos, the organization that MAPS started, that had been carried out the clinical trials. One way is that there's a negotiation with the FDA, where FDA agrees to collect the future data that's required in a post-marketing study or a phase 4 study, and revisit the decision of saying no to the original submission of last year. Or there's an outcome where FDA will indeed mandate for Lykos to conduct another phase 3 trial to collect the additional information that it's shared with Lykos. There are obviously big implications in terms of timeline and cost. If Lykos does indeed need to conduct another phase 3 trial, this could be, the 3 to 4 or 5 year process that will cost a lot of money and will, most importantly, greatly delay access to this treatment for people that deeply, deeply need it. I think often the statistics of how many veterans commit suicide, every day, it's a staggering number. And that's, of course, true for vets, but it's also true in general for the wider population of PTSD patients, which actually is more than 13 million people in the US only, let alone over 300 million people around the world. With the main cause of PTSD in the US and likely around the world actually being sexual violence, and the population being of women. So I know we often talk about the importance of making this available to vets, and there is also a much wider population of there are people that struggle with this condition. And it looks like more investors are contributing to capitalize Lykos in the way that will be necessary to pursue one of these two options. But in my mind, there is no doubt that psychedelic therapy will become accessible down the line. Maybe MDMA won't be the first one. Maybe we'll see Compass Pathways or USONA or BMOR with the New York University actually achieving approval for psilocybin before MDMA is approved. And then there are plenty of other psychedelics or psychedelic analogs that are being evaluated now through clinical trials with the FDA domestically and abroad. okay, so what needs to happen for these treatments to become available to as many people as possible? Because we still have the issue of access. Of course, to do psychedelic therapy done well, there's not only a medicine component, but there's also a therapy component. In the best, protocols possible, we know that having preparation sessions, a medicine session, integration sessions, and repeating this sequence a couple, 2 or 3 times can help a lot with outcomes. And this is particularly true for MDMA. Many other drug developers are now kind of have dropped the aspect of therapy to make it a little bit easier on them to achieve FDA approval. And I'm pointing to one of the issues that led to FDA saying no, which was like, okay, FDA doesn't regulate therapy. So Library had submitted something that combined therapy plus drug. And so you can see that there's an issue here of like, oh, we're presenting a new model that we know works very well, but the institution maybe is not ready to evaluate it the way that would be best for the patient outcomes. And so let's keep in mind that there's a trade-off between what will be best for the patients and what is the system able to digest, particularly what are the incentives of the system. So one example of this is there is one psychedelic that's approved in mental health that's called Spravato, and it's a ketamine spray or S-ketamine spray that was developed by Janssen, the pharmaceutical arm of J&J. And it's now available and reimbursed by insurance. And I think that this is great because it can be a very powerful way to help people that struggle with suicidal ideation when they have major depressive disorder, or for people that have treatment-resistant depression or have failed 2 or more oral antidepressants before. This can be life-saving medicine. I think there are many, many, many accounts of people accessing Spravato or other forms of ketamine and feeling a lot of relief. And the system is designed in such a way that people will come to the clinic, take the drug, leave the clinic, and then come back another time that week, and then eventually come back every week for who knows how long. And I think that while this can be helpful, it really resembles the way that pharmacotherapies have been rolled out, with the past decades with SSRIs or other anti-anxiety, which can be very helpful for some people that also don't work for many. So the message that we've been developing, we're trying to bring forward is that it's not just important to deal with the symptoms, but it's also very important to deal with the root cause of your mental illness. And so that's why combining the drug with the therapy is an important component. Turns out, though, it's not very profitable to do that. Because you, as a pharmaceutical company, you want to keep charging for the pharmaceutical that you give. So if you're designing a protocol where you're trying to address the root cause and give some medication, but then kind of be done with it, that it doesn't make as much money. And so it makes sense that the incentives are not aligned.
We're gonna get into this, I promise, because I'm so excited to have a conversation around what's the right corporate structure, and a lot of that comes from a decision MAPS made, I think in the 2000s, to kind of reorient as a public benefit corporation, and then ultimately Lycos, right? But before we get into that thread, which I think is going to be deeply fascinating on how you're thinking about your next journey and the structure, can you, one of the things that I want to really appreciate is the industry is still nascent as we look at it in a lot of ways, despite its history being thousands, maybe millions of years serving humanity. What do you think, the industry needs to do to define metrics for long-term, well-being, psychological growth, quality of life that you think can capture the constant reported benefits that people have, right, from this? Like, how do you think the industry has to move forward around metrics and measurement?
Yeah, I think it's a question for the industry. It's also a question for regulators. I think it's a well-known fact that we live in an epidemic of mental illness. Progressively, more and more people struggle with anxiety, depression, substance use disorders, which is a huge problem in the US with over 100,000 people dying every year of overdose, and that's accidental or not. And so organizing public health decisions and policy to focus on reducing suffering for people and creating access to mental health treatments in a way that in the past few decades, sometimes we made progress on considering mental health at parity with physical health. But I think we need to make more progress in that we want to make sure that treatments, including psychotherapy, are reimbursed by insurance and by Medicare and by the system. Just so that you know, one of the main issues that exist is that therapists that decide to offer the treatments through insurance are mandated by insurance companies to charge a lower amount. So the incentive for therapy is actually that not of offering insurance, but to be paid out of pocket. And this obviously needs to change. We need to ensure that therapists can be paid the amount that they need to sustain their practice and their lives. So that's one example. And then, of course, we want to be looking at patient outcomes. So we need to be looking at people feeling better when it comes to this wide variety of conditions that they struggle with. And so how to align metrics in the industry and in public policy, this is going to be a really interesting topic, because not always pharma or even public policy have the right incentives and the right metrics in hand. I think it's essential that we just look at, when it comes to PTSD scales or depression scales or anxiety scales, and we really drive interventions and coverage for treatments that will decrease those metrics and help people feel better.
For the listeners, what's exciting you right now for yourself? Where do you take all this knowledge, all this experience? And what I'm feeling is purpose. What are you looking at doing?
I think a caveat, for a lot of people in the psychedelic field, the arrival of Spravato, with Spravato costing $850 a dose, where regular off-label ketamine can literally be $1.50 a dose, that was a kind of a really hard thing to digest. That a pharmaceutical company would come and patent a specific formulation of ketamine that could be patented to develop a drug that could be sold for so much money, I think definitely rattled a lot, and including myself. Yeah. And as I spent more time working in the field, I realized that we need to figure out a way to take advantage of the system to actually create more patient access. And I'll give you an example of that. When at MAPS and Lycos, we were evaluating how to price MDMA, there were at least two schools of thoughts around that. One was, let's price the drug as low as possible, which will totally maximize access. And then some other people said, well, if you charge very little for the drug, the organizations that are staying to gain most of that value are the insurance companies, which will see their patients feeling better and being less expensive for them while not having to pay for that reimbursement. So all the value accrued in the system for healing people would actually go into the pockets of an insurance company. And so some people would say, why don't we charge as much as insurance companies will cover, and then take this extra money and use it for patient access for those that are underinsured or uninsured, including covering not just the cost of medication, but the cost of therapy. I think that it's kind of like a radical approach of, if we are in the system, like, we need to work with the system to not leave value on the table, capture as much value as possible, to then make it available for people who need it most. And so this was a big takeaway for me. And so when I think about the system right now, what I want to do is work with approved medicines where there is a reimbursement from insurance that can then be used to help people have as much access as possible. I would like this to happen across all psychedelics, but the only one that's approved right now for insurance reimbursement is Spravato. And so right now people are going in and out of the clinic, and clinicians get to seek reimbursement for those treatments, and people don't have to pay except for the copay, which I think is positive. But at the same time, we're not addressing the root cause. We're not providing the therapy. Why? Because providing therapy on, near the use, before or after the use of Spravato or during the use of Spravato is actually not very economical. It's more profitable for a clinic to have the patient come in and out and not provide any other services and just bank on the insurance reimbursement. I think it makes sense. There's plenty of interventional psychiatric clinics offering Spravato now, and Spravato has just crossed $1 billion in sales, I think, last quarter. And it's definitely a blockbuster drug right now. And so that works for the people in the system. Is this helping patients as much as they can be helped? Like, my theory is no. So something else should be offered. And because there is a shortage of therapies, which is the biggest problem, that there's more demand for psychological services and psychiatric services than providers are available, a model to explore is that of group therapy, which is something at MAPS we've helped a lot of researchers around the world come up and experiment with group therapy model, including the Veteran Administration. So my idea is to see if we can provide a group therapy container to people that are taking a psychedelic drug for their mental health, starting possibly with Spravato or off-label ketamine if we're going to be able to unlock reimbursement for that. And then eventually as psychedelics like psilocybin or MDMA or 5-MeO become available, to also expand the offering when it comes to that. And so the best way that I can think to create access for people that can't afford to pay out-of-pocket services for therapy and psychedelics is to work within the realm of what's approved by insurance, and then make psychedelic or psychological services like group therapy available to people that are taking the medication.
The comment that's coming up for me is the model that existed in the past has used addiction to treat addiction, right? In a way, it's like, we're going to make you take this pill every single day for the rest of your life to address a disease that you may have very little control over, right? And I think what you're alluding to is powerful, right? And you think about group therapy, I think the first image that came to mind was really a spiritual, like indigenous culture ceremony, where it's clear the community that support you. And it's what this country has done with AA, right? It's been used in this country to treat a large volume of people while making an economic sense, right? Talk to us a little bit more about what you think about in terms of structures around this potential company that you're building.
I would say that it's always a question, okay, should this be a nonprofit or a for-profit? And like, what are the differences of that? Like, one big experience that I take away from my time at MAPS is that MAPS as a nonprofit built a wholly owned, at the time, public benefit corporation, which is a form of corporation available in Delaware law that is different than a C Corp. A C Corp is what most companies are built at, and the main goal is to maximize value for shareholders. A PBC, or a public benefit corporation, balances shareholder profit with social good in such a way that if a business decision is made that will not maximize profits for shareholders, but it will positively impact society, then it's okay to make that decision. And shareholders can't sue you just as easily as they could if you were just a C Corp trying to do something good for the world that wasn't good for the shareholders. So I'm a big fan of this type of corporation, and I'm actually very happy to see that a lot of the even AI companies that are being built now are being built as public benefit corporations. And I think a great example of that is Anthropic, which not only was started as a public benefit corporation, but also created a long-term benefit trust that sits on top of the board of Anthropic. And I think eventually over time, we'll have the ability to choose the board members of Anthropic. And this is an uninterested group of people, like luminaries in the field, that don't have a financial tie to Anthropic. So it doesn't matter how much Anthropic makes money, they will still be choosing the people on the board and the governance of Anthropic to ensure that public benefit is pursued. So these are great examples. And there are other companies. The first technology company to ever transition from being a C Corp to a PBC as a public company was actually Viva Systems, which makes software for pharmaceutical industry. And then there was an organization, the first publicly traded pharmaceutical company to go from being a C Corp to a PBC was United Therapeutics. Amazing leadership in both organizations. So we have examples of the capitalistic system veering towards, okay, we can maximize profit while not hurting the planet and society in those ways that we've seen. Unfortunately, capitalism can have sometimes unintended consequences or externalities that are not being managed very well. So when I think about how to structure something like this endeavor, I would most certainly, if it was a for-profit, lean into this type of public benefit for-profit structure. And then also have an affiliated nonprofit where we can raise money to then provide access for people that couldn't afford some aspects of the treatment And there's a beautiful example for an organization that I'm actually collaborating with right now called Beckley Retreats that does that. And so not only does it charge for the psychedelic retreats that take place in the Netherlands and Jamaica in such a way that they can then offer scholarships to people that can't afford that rate, but also has a sister nonprofit where alumni of the program, as well as other members of the community, can donate so that people that can't afford the retreat can then be able to afford it. And we keep working on creating more accessible retreats. Because again, lots of people can access beautiful experiences with psychedelics, but it can be expensive. And so I think it's important for us to focus on how to create as much access as possible for those that can't afford it.
One of the themes of this podcast, or the idea behind Believe in Aliens, is celebrating people who leave their comfort zones to build something new in unfamiliar territory. Your story coming from Italy, the life experience that you had to endure, overcome, and welcome in, is one of going away from comfort, going in towards discomfort to learn more. How was that experience, the outsider view, shaped the way you are, what you want to build now? What were some of the fresh perspectives that you brought, even using MAPS as an example, to the organization, that maybe those who were not outside of their comfort zone may have missed?
That's such a good question. I remember the day I left my tech job in 2019, and I was about to update my LinkedIn to something that instead of saying, go to market, like something said like psychedelic medicine. And I was there with my finger on my mouse, be like, am I gonna like click submit to this? And then everybody's gonna know that like I'm working in psychedelic field. People gonna think I'm crazy. But it was only really a split second, be like, no, this is so important. Of course I will do it. And in some ways, put my like professional career at risk. It's like, am I ever going to be hireable again in the tech world after having worked in psychedelics? Thankfully, it's not interesting to me to think about, pursuing a job and being hired in the tech world because I'm passionate about what I do. But so that was definitely one of the aspects. But then also just like deciding to go work for a nonprofit in the field that was championing an approach that was had never been done before. This idea of coupling therapy with pharmacotherapy to a point where like it required so much work with in alignment with the FDA that ultimately actually a roadblock last August, but still truly believing that that's the right approach. So it doesn't matter how MDMA is going to be approved in the future. We know that the best way to administer that will be through a program that includes therapy. And we've been training thousands and thousands of therapists, not only domestically, but also internationally to learn how to do that, which I think is incredible. So I think that these are examples of not doing things that are done the way that it's usually done, but pushing the boundary, not accepting what's being done right now by the system, not accepting the status quo is what's best for people and for people's health. And then also another thing from being an outsider, I think in a lot of the developed world, healthcare is something that the government will provide, the society provides. I think people's well-being, both physically and mentally, is a universally recognized human right. And so for me to be fighting for access to health in the United States, in the place that I chose to be, my world and my country and the place where my children are born, I definitely love it, so many aspects, but also I'm so taken aback by some of the shortcomings and, healthcare and access to healthcare, particularly mental health care is a really big one. People don't choose to be traumatized. Nobody wants to be traumatized. This just happens to people. But I've also learned, especially being a father of young children, that we as humans are kind of biologically programmed to thrive. If you just allow kids to, be raised in an environment without violence and without trauma, people thrive. And so for those of us out there, and there are many that had the bad luck of being exposed to really traumatic events or adverse events in childhood, we want to allow everybody to have access to healing. I don't think there's something more important than that, because once you've done that, you unlock people's potential to their fullest. And that can be great for GDP.
100%. It's, making me do a play on words, but if you can unshackle your mind, you can reach your infinite potential.
Yes.
Right? Um, and I think there's something really beautiful about that transformation. Um, I use a metaphor at Unshackled around the concept of building phone booths for people, right? A space that someone can go into to transform the way that Clark Kent becomes Superman. We're not changing the person. We're just giving somebody a safe place to become who they want to be. And what you're describing is an offering for a lifetime of becoming who they want to be, right? By giving them a safe place to turn to, a group, a community,
Mhm.
because it is who they are. I think that's exactly the acceptance that oftentimes is hard to find. So I love what you're saying, and you know I want to put a finer point on this, and through a question. We hear a lot of stories about people who took pain as motivation. How should we think about that in your story, right? How have you taken the pain of likely even before 19 years old, the pain of a childhood, right? Witnessing what you had to witness and use that as a form of motivation versus being overwhelmed by it. And maybe that was part of the cycle. But how should we think about your journey?
Well, sometimes I can't but think about how lucky I've been in life that I have had opportunities to strive for, progress and motivation and healing, and I've had the opportunities that I've had. And I think that's not true for a lot of people. A lot of people are just like subject to trauma in a way that just won't give them a way out. Again, I think it's pretty natural. Like when given the opportunity, I think lots of people will want to do better and access redemption and access opportunity. It's just like remove the blockers. Yeah, I think it's hard for me to think that this is a broader topic, but like, do we have agency of free will, and to what extent that's true? We, or I can say, when given the opportunity to operate more freely and yeah, unshackled from trauma, it became like automatic to be able to thrive more. So I think we really want to enable people to achieve their best by helping them heal themselves in many ways, right? And with mental health, I think that this is true. Like and it's the intervention that we propose here is something that allows people to like process internally and evolve out of a state where they're kind of blocked. So that's what I would say. Like I don't know, I don't know so much about what particularly inside of myself, provides the drive, but seeing how good and helpful and impactful something was for me and wanting to share with everyone else. I think ultimately this is one of the ways that we evolved as humans. There's this theory about how humans eventually discover psychedelics. Like I can think about this like caveman in the past, like eating some mushroom and then going back to the village, be like, hey, I found something awesome. Like you should all try it. Like, isn't that what we try to do as humans? Like we create knowledge, we discover things, and then we share them with the rest of society. That's all we're trying to do here. And it's not even us, like we're just standing on the shoulder of giants of the past,
Yeah.
of ancient traditions, indigenous communities, and researchers on all in all sides of the world that have really done a lot of work to try to uncover the benefits of these modalities. And it's not just psychedelics; it's also spirituality, meditation, and a bunch of other areas.
Oh man, there's so many threads that we could continue conversating on. Um, I am curious because of your journey, and we started off with your story alluding to being a father of three. If they were to listen to this and could understand this, what do you want them to know?
Mm. That's a good question. Sometimes my wife and I wonder, especially she's also an immigrant. These kids are born in San Francisco in the Bay Area from two, educated parents with a lot of opportunities. Like, how are we gonna ensure that they operate in a way that like is mindful and not distracted by a lot of the material things that happen in this world today. I, I would just say to not take for granted the luck and the privilege, and to orient its abilities and their ability and their luck towards something that can be meaningful and helpful for other people. In many ways, like if we have the privilege to have access to knowledge, to tools, to impact, to really assume the responsibility of wanting to do something good for other people. There's way too much inequality. There's way too much suffering in the world that we can totally address with the tools and the means that we have. So that's, I hope, a message that comes through to them.
It's beautiful, and as a father of 2 kids, I would really hope that message comes through as well. I think it's a real privilege to be in this conversation that we're having right now. But the work is obviously endless, and humanity is needing it. So I want to wrap us up, because I think we've had so much to digest in this conversation. The purpose of this podcast is to challenge your perspectives. And I think everything you've heard today in Fede's story, whether it was by choice or force, he ultimately did challenge his own perspectives to see what was possible. And if you're fortunate to feel what I'm feeling right now, listening to him, that he's just starting, and today's day zero again. And so much of what we do at Believe in Aliens is to bring those stories out, to inspire you to take action. And as Fede does, build bridges. And so thank you so much, Fede, for joining us. I know we have so much more to talk about, and we will.
We will.
And again, Believe in Aliens is about curiosity and breaking through conventional wisdom to make humanity a better place. So thank you very much, Fede. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
And to all the listeners, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the pod, please take a moment to share it with a friend. You can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts can be found. This show is produced by Anand Shah. I'm your host, Manan Mehta. And this has been an effing funny production. Do you believe in aliens? I do.